it's Allie, and today we are going to be tackling the behemoth of a plot structure that is the hero's journey. So let's start off with a bit of history, shall we? The hero's journey, as we know it, was popularized by a man named James Campbell in a 1949 work called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. The actual plot structure we're talking about today, you can find roots to it back in like the 1800s, but for the purposes of today, we're going to be talking about James Campbell's work. Campbell took the common threads that he saw in a lot of different stories and classic myths and tales to create the monomyth, or the hero's journey, which he describes as a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from his mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. But I mentioned before that this is a behemoth of a plot structure, so that one paragraph is not all we are going to be discussing today. Rather, let us now go step by step through all of the different plot elements that this structure requires you to have. Like the traditional 3-act structure that we talked about in the first of these plot structure explained videos, there are 3 acts in this hero's journey. Act 1, the departure act, Act 2, the initiation act, and then Act 3, the return act. We start off with plot point 1, which is the ordinary world. This is something that we see in a lot of different plot structures, the idea that you need to give your audience a sense of perspective of where their hero begins so that you can better see how they are going to change and grow throughout the story, and just how strange and unusual the plot events of whatever adventure they're about to go on are truly going to be for them compared to that base point. Plot point number 2 is the call to adventure. So this is basically the inciting incident where our hero is going to interact with the main plot for the first time. This could also be kind of like a first plot point. There isn't really a specification in this plot structure, but basically our hero encounters a call to adventure. The hero's journey doesn't specify what exactly this call to adventure has to be. It can be the hero striking out on their own, it could be some other force coming to tell the hero they have to go do the thing, or it could be something that they stumble upon out of just being an idiot. It really can take a bunch of different forms. The point of this is just to get your hero out of their comfort zone. So it shares similarities with the first plot point in that way. Then we move on to plot point 3, which is where things get a little bit touchy in terms of if this really follows every single story you've ever read. And that is the refusal of the call. So your character has been summoned to go on this adventure, but through whatever reason, whether it be internal or external, they have decided that they're not going to do it. They're going to go back to their ordinary life, and they are going to kind of dig in their feet, stay where they're at, and the story's not going to happen anymore. Obviously, we know what's going to come from that later, but for now, our character has decided that this is not for them, and they are not the adventuring type. This leads us then into plot point 4, which is meeting the mentor character. This character is meant to kind of push your character along the right path by helping them feel more capable of going on this adventure or completing the task, whatever the case may be in your particular story. And it really depends on you what that mentor might be. It might be a teacher, it might be a wizard, it might be any kind of thing. The point is that there's going to be some external character that is going to hype your character up enough, or teach him or her or them enough things that they are going to be able to continue forth into the rest of the story. After meeting the mentor and learning whatever they can from that character, they are ready to move on to plot point number 5, which is crossing the first threshold. This is essentially where the story begins in earnest, where our main character has committed themselves to the mission and are now ready to go out and do the thing. This is where we move on to Act 2. So we have left now the departure stage and have moved on to the initiation stage. After they have completed the first threshold, which they may or may not succeed in, we move on to plot point number 6, which is less so a plot point and more so just the inclusion of allies, tests, and enemies that are starting to hinder or help our hero's cause. This is about the same as the getting used to the new world stage that happens right after the first plot point. So right at the beginning of Act 2, which is pretty much where we are here. The departure stage has more stuff in it than a typical Act 1. Act 1 really only necessitates that you have an inciting incident, if that. The inciting incident doesn't even need to be in the story, as long as you have a first plot point. So the first plot point is the only thing that really needs to shake up your character's life, but in the departure act that we're talking about with Hero's Journey, a lot has already happened. They've already had their kind of training montage with a mentor, they've already had their first brush with the enemy or antagonistic force, whatever it may be, and we've already left their ordinary daily life. So a lot has happened in the departure stage, but now they are officially on the journey, so they have officially left the state of comfort that they had before in the previous act. So it's the same kind of feeling of getting used to this new world, the new rules, and whether or not our character is capable of handling those rules. So this is a very long part of the hero's journey, just getting the character used to all of these different things that they need to learn and getting them ready for the next part of this very long plot structure. Point number 7 is approach to the Innermost Cave, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that your character is going to get closer than they ever have before to the villain or whatever antagonist exists in your story. So if you have a villain that has a secret lair, this is the approach to that secret lair. If you have a war that is brewing, then this is where your character is going to really come face to face with the implications of that, or even with specific members that are a part of that war for the first time right here. This is basically just a sense of impending doom, even though we have not quite gotten to this doom yet. The Innermost Cave is usually not only going to be where your villain or antagonist is located, it's also going to be where your character's goal lies. So if you have a thing like the ring and you need to take the ring to Mordor, then not only are you confronting that enemy and getting closer to that enemy with every step you take, but you're also getting closer to your goal with every step you take. So not only is there a sense of getting closer to the doom, but also getting closer to your overall goal. After approaching that Innermost Cave, we have our characters face an ordeal, which is plot point number 8. And that is basically our character's lowest point, which is something that I've mentioned in the previous plot structure explained videos that I have made on the topic. And that's basically just where your character has their really lowest point. All of the things that your character has been working towards up until this point, they are now no longer certain that they are capable of succeeding in their goal. The only thing I will say about this particular plot structure that makes it a bit different from the traditional 3-act lowest point element is that the hero's journey kind of doesn't require, but there is this idea that your character is going to face their biggest fear at this point. So it's not just a sense that your character no longer feels confident in themselves to do it, but that they are going to have to face their greatest personal fear in order to take any further steps forward. So those are very similar things, but they are slightly different, so I wanted to point those two things out, because the general idea with the hero's journey ordeal is that after facing this greatest fear that your hero has, they are then able to fully claim the title of a true hero and blaze forth into the rest of the story. This then leads us on to point number 9, which is seizing the sword, also called the reward, and this is basically where our character kind of takes up the mantle of hero and surges forth into the rest of the story. You might now be thinking that the story is pretty much over. We have seen the character seize up the sword, go through their darkest moment, and they've now fought the baddies, and they've either succeeded or failed. Chances are they've succeeded if we're talking about the hero's journey. But so now what's left in the story to do? Well, you know what? This is actually just the end of Act 2, according to this structure. So there is a lot more still left to come. That is why plot point 10 is the road back, or the road home. And that is basically where your character has finished doing the thing that they need to do, but now they need to go all the way back home. And it might not be as simple as just walking back or, fast traveling back home. They need to go through more stuff on their way home. This is now Act 3, which Act 3 is like all of just the return journey. The road back is characterized by this idea that maybe you've defeated the big baddie, or maybe you've gotten the thing that you needed to get, but there's still other people around that want that thing or that followed that baddie, and so you still have to fight those other people and get those other things, keep the thing you have safe while you try to get back home. This can also have certain character development aspects as well, where your character is now a changed person, so they can't really consider going back to their original home, ordinary life that we saw way back at the beginning of the story. So this is kind of a time for small villains to pop back up, or also for some character angst to happen. That then leads us on to plot point 11, which is the final test. This plot point is called Resurrection, and it's really just where the true climax of the story happens. This is where, even if you thought you defeated the big baddie, chances are the big baddie is not actually dead, and now they're here to reclaim whatever thing you stole from them, so on and so forth. So this is the real final test to see if your character has been able to come out the other end of the ordeal, if that fight, that seizing of the sword, was just a fluke, and to really wrap up the main plot of the story before we head back home. And then finally, with plot point number 12, return with the elixir. This is something that is actually, the elixir comes from a much earlier version of the hero's journey, which was based on medical practices, this idea of a medical story of going somewhere to retrieve an elixir and then coming home to treat the masses. But return with the elixir is basically just return having finished the thing. And so if you had a MacGuffin, then this is the point where you return with that thing that you needed. If you're talking about something like Lord of the Rings, this is the point where the hobbits return to the Shire, and all of that kind of stuff. This is the true resolution of your story, where you return back to where you started, to this ordinary life. You might have some character development stuff here where the character no longer feels like they belong in this ordinary life. That's something that happens with Lord of the Rings, obviously. Or you could have it just be, you know, this happy parade where they're all just so glad that you have returned, and that kind of thing. So this is the final plot point. 12 plot points in one plot structure. And as you can kind of tell, there are a lot of things that are similar that do kind of make sense if you apply it to different stories, but certainly, especially with things like the inclusion of a mentor or the seizing of the sword followed by a final test after that, those aren't really things that you see in every single story. So a very long plot structure, a lot of different points, and now let's get into a little bit about how you can use this plot structure and also whether or not I recommend you use it. First of all, let me point out that just because you use the hero's journey does not mean that you have to use every single element. I myself don't use this plot structure, and I think I've made it clear through this video that there are a lot of things about it that I don't think is a good idea to follow to the letter, because I think you would create stale stories that way. But that being said, I do use certain elements of this plot structure, and I do think that there are ways to use this plot structure to your benefit, as long as you're not focusing on it too much. Plenty of stories have a mentor character, and plenty don't, and that is totally fine. And just because this plot structure says that you should have one, none of that means that you need to have that as well. So rules are made to be broken. Feel free to break the rules, but if you are really inspired by this idea of a more long-form kind of real true adventure story, something like Lord of the Rings, then this is a great idea for you to look at, because as I kind of mentioned throughout all of those different steps, we're talking about a bunch of different stages that happen in a lot more rapid succession than you might see in a traditional 3-act structure. So back when I talked about 3-act structure in that first video I ever made on plot structure, we were talking about how Act 1 typically is going to take up 25% of your story. And for 25% of your story, for it only to consist of that ordinary life stage and also a first plot point, then you might find that that is too slow for you. That is going to drag too much. So you might then experiment with using your first act as more of the developmental act, like what we were talking about with the hero's journey. Something where you have a character who shows their daily life, but then brushes up against the adventure, then refuses the adventure, then gets a mentor, and then gets whatever. Or maybe you only take a couple of those elements, because all of that stuff for the hero's journey fits into that first act. So for you, maybe that is a great way to structure your first act if you want it to be a little bit more fast-paced and lead on to a more adventurous second and third act. The one issue that I do have with the hero's journey, or the monomyth as it is sometimes called, is the idea that every story in some way follows this structure. And in the book The Hero with 1,000 Faces, there are a lot of examples where Campbell tried to cram stories to fit these different plot points where they really just didn't need to. So that is one thing I will say for you pantsers out there, is I mentioned before in my 3-act structure video that I think it's a good idea, even if you pants your novel, to then go back with your completed draft and see if you can come up with some general placing of acts in your pacing. And if you don't have that, then maybe you have some plot structure issues, or maybe you're just using a different plot structure in your mind or something like that. But with the hero's journey, I don't recommend this for pantsers whatsoever, because I think if you want to plot your novel, picking and choosing some of the elements of the hero's journey that you want, if you want a more by the books rendition of a plot structure and you're not satisfied with just a vague idea of beginning, middle, and end, then by all means take some stuff from this. But please don't take your pantsed first draft and then decide you need to scrap everything because it doesn't fit these 12 plot points, because it's just, that's a lot and you don't need to bother with that. So that is basically my recommendation. I know it's a little bit more confusing than just do it or don't do it, but I very much recommend that you know about it because I think that you can use a lot of these things to your advantage. But I also don't necessarily recommend that you try to play this one by the books, whereas something like the KM Wyland expanded 3-act structure or the traditional 3-act structure, I think those are kind of safe for you to play by the books because there's already so much you can do to expand on that and to be creative with that. It's not really trying to get you to follow any kind of specific rule set, whereas this one definitely is. This one is way more specific than anything we've talked about before. So that is my recommendation for you. Just be wary when you are going through these plot structures. But I do think it's a really interesting plot structure, and I do think that it does match up really well with something like that kind of Lord of the Rings, almost Dungeons and Dragons like fantasy adventure story. So if that is the kind of story you are writing, then I definitely recommend you take a look at this. And if you are not writing that kind of story, then why not also just take a look and see if you can find any of these elements that you might want to use and inspire yourself with in your own stories. So with that being said, that is all I have to say today about the hero's journey. Let me know in the comments if you have ever used this structure yourself. I would be very interested since I've never actually tried to write a story by the books with this particular structure. So let me know, and if you liked this video, do give it a like, and if you like my content, do subscribe. I make videos every Friday, and I will see you guys in the next one.